I was on my fourth work trip. When the email came in, "You're fired," I just smiled. 72 hours later, 3 clients froze the deal, and $380 million walked out the door with me. Sup Reddit. I'm Hunter, 31 male. I tried to write the short version of this, but I couldn't. So grab a snack and get comfortable because this one's a bit long and complicated. The email hit my inbox somewhere over the Atlantic. The flight attendant had stopped offering me the complimentary pretzels around hour 2, probably because I'd eaten 4 bags already, and she was starting to look at me with genuine concern. Economy class. 10 days, 3 countries, 4 flights, 1 deal worth $380 million, and I was crammed into a middle seat because someone in accounting had decided that business class tickets were not aligned with current budget priorities. Meanwhile, Bennett Aldrich, the CEO's nephew, had flown business class to a leadership conference in Scottsdale last month, where his biggest accomplishment was getting a sunburn and losing his company laptop at a resort pool. That's when I saw it. Subject line: termination notice, effective immediately. A paragraph of corporate template language explaining that my access had been revoked, my credentials suspended, and that I should not return to company property. The whole thing read like it had been generated by an HR software program that charged by the word and had no soul. Which, now that I think about it, is probably exactly what happened. The sender was Walter Aldrich, CEO of Aldrich Infrastructure Group, the same Walter who had looked me in the eye 11 days ago, shaken my hand with both of his in that way that politicians do, and told me I was the only person he trusted to close the Bridger deal. The Bridger deal. 3 utility clients across 3 regions. Grid-scale solar, battery storage, substation upgrades. I'd spent 10 months building this thing from scratch. Every relationship, every site visit, every conference call at 3 a.m. because someone in Germany didn't understand time zones. $380 million in contracts over 5 years. The biggest deal in company history. I'd signed the final preliminary agreement in Brazil exactly 8 hours ago. Shook hands with their CEO. Now I was unemployed at 35,000 feet, wedged between a snoring stranger and a window that showed nothing but black Atlantic Ocean. I didn't panic, just sat there in that miserable seat, staring at the email, and felt something cold and calm settle into my brain. I tried logging into our project management system. Access denied. Company email, gone. The shared drive with 10 months of my work, locked out. They'd scrubbed me from every system like I was a virus that needed quarantining. I reached into my backpack and pulled out a second laptop. My girlfriend Cassidy had insisted I keep everything separate. She works in contracts and compliance for a different company, and she's the kind of person who reads terms of service documents for fun and spots loopholes in rental agreements within 30 seconds. About 8 months ago, she'd sat me down and explained, in detailed and slightly terrifying terms, exactly how companies screw over departing employees. If they ever try to bury you, she'd said, you need clean hands and clean hardware. Everything on their systems belongs to them. Everything on your systems belongs to you. Never mix the two. I powered on the laptop, logged into an encrypted email service that had nothing to do with Aldrich infrastructure, checked 3 messages from people who had no idea I'd just been fired, but who were very much expecting to hear from me. They thought terminating me mid-flight would leave me stranded and desperate. Instead, they'd just cut the last thread connecting me to a company that had been using me as a workhorse while treating me like a temp. I closed both laptops, shoved the world's worst travel pillow behind my neck, and actually managed to sleep for the first time in 4 days. Now let me back up. 6 months before that email, I started noticing patterns that didn't add up. And I'm not talking subtle hints. I'm talking neon signs with arrows pointing at them. The first red flag was the promotion that evaporated like morning fog. I'd been running international project development for Aldrich for 7 years, closing deals nobody else could close, flying to job sites nobody else wanted to visit, spending holidays in airports and weekends on conference calls with nervous executives who needed their hands held through complex technical decisions. When the VP of Global Operations position opened up, I figured it was basically mine. I had the track record. I had the client relationships. I had recommendation letters from utility executives in 4 different countries who specifically requested me for their projects. Then they gave it to Bennett, the CEO's nephew, a guy who'd been with the company for 19 months and whose primary qualifications seemed to be sharing genetic material with the man who signed the paychecks. His entire professional experience consisted of an MBA from a school that advertised on highway billboards, a brief stint at a consulting firm that no longer existed, and 18 months of sitting in on meetings I ran while occasionally asking questions that made clients uncomfortable. I once watched Bennett ask a utility executive if solar panels stored sunlight for nighttime use. The silence that followed was painful. I had to jump in and redirect the conversation before we lost a $40 million contract to sheer secondhand embarrassment. At the announcement party, Bennett found me near the coffee station and extended his hand with confidence. "Hunter, I'm really looking forward to working with you. Learning from you, really. Uncle Walter says you're the best closer we've got." I shook his hand and smiled. Said congratulations. Didn't mention that closer was apparently a different category than leader, and that the distinction seemed to be entirely about whose last name was on the building. The second red flag was the credit theft, which happened with such regularity that I started keeping a spreadsheet. I spent 3 months developing a proposal for a major grid upgrade project in Nevada. Site assessments in desert heat that made my rental car's dashboard display an actual warning about exterior temperatures. Permit research that required me to become an expert in county zoning regulations I'd never wanted to know about. Interconnection studies with the local utility that involved approximately 47 conference calls, each one slightly more tedious than the last. When the client signed, the internal announcement credited the win to the global operations team under Bennett Aldrich's leadership. My name appeared in a footnote, listed under technical consultation. Technical consultation. Like I was the IT guy who fixed the projector, rather than the person who'd built the entire deal and flown out to close it. I brought it up to my manager. He made a face like I'd asked him to solve a complex math problem, while also juggling, and said I should focus on team success rather than individual recognition. I pointed out that there was no team, that I'd done the work alone, and that Bennett had attended exactly one meeting at the very end where his contribution consisted of nodding at appropriate intervals. The third red flag was Bennett himself, who had developed credit theft into an art form. The guy had a sixth sense for showing up at exactly the right moment to claim work he hadn't done. He'd wander into a client meeting I was running, ask one or two surface-level questions, and then somehow end up being the person who led the engagement in the follow-up report. He'd CC himself on email chains he had nothing to do with, then forward them to Walter with commentary that made it sound like he'd been driving the project all along. The worst part was watching him try to actually do technical work. I sat in on a call once where he explained to a client that battery storage systems work basically like a really big phone charger, but for buildings. The client's chief engineer looked like he was experiencing a minor stroke. I had to mute myself so no one would hear me laughing, then unmute to salvage what was left of the conversation. Another time, he tried to lead a site visit at a solar installation we'd completed. He showed up in Italian leather shoes and a fancy suit. By hour 2, he'd stepped in something unpleasant, complained about the heat 6 times, and asked the foreman why the panels weren't facing the sun directly. The foreman, a guy named Doug who'd been in the industry for 30 years, looked at me with an expression that combined exhaustion and murderous intent. I had to explain that the panels were tracking systems that moved throughout the day. Bennett nodded like this was information he'd definitely known all along. He also had a habit of making promises to clients that we couldn't keep. He'd tell them timelines were no problem without checking with engineering. He'd agree to specifications we didn't offer. He'd commit to pricing that didn't exist in any budget I'd ever seen. Then he'd forward the email chain to me with a note saying, "Can you make this work?" But the moment I knew I was truly done came during a board lunch about 4 months before the firing. I was in the adjacent conference room, prepping materials for an afternoon client presentation. The door between the rooms hadn't latched properly. I could hear Walter talking to 2 board members, their voices carrying through the gap. One of the board members laughed about something. Then Walter's voice, clear as day. "Hunter's good at what he does. Excellent closer. But he's not leadership material. Doesn't have the right presence. The clients love him, but we need him in the field, not in the boardroom." I stood there holding a binder full of work that had made these people millions of dollars, heard them reduce 7 years of my career to field work. I walked back to my desk, opened a private browser, and started researching how to form an LLC. That night, I told Cassidy everything. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said something that cut through all the noise. "They see you as a tool. You'll never be anything else to them, because you being more than that threatens the people who are less." She helped me build the framework for what would eventually become Ironwood infrastructure. We spent nights and weekends setting it up. No investors. No announcements. No paper trail connecting back to Aldrich. Just a clean legal entity, a growing network of former colleagues who'd been pushed out the same way I was being pushed, and a plan. I kept closing deals for Aldrich, kept flying to job sites, kept smiling in meetings while quietly preparing for the day when smiling wouldn't be necessary anymore. The Bridger deal was supposed to be my masterpiece. 3 utility clients across 3 regions, all signing on for coordinated infrastructure upgrades. Grid-scale solar, battery storage, substation modernization. The kind of project that takes years of relationship building and months of technical coordination. Getting there was its own special adventure. First stop was Frankfurt. My connecting flight out of Newark was delayed 4 hours because of mechanical issues, which the gate agent explained with the weary resignation of someone who'd given this speech 800 times. I missed my original connection and had to sprint through the terminal to catch a later flight that was already boarding, arriving at the gate sweating through my shirt and breathing like I'd just finished a marathon. Then TSA pulled me aside for additional screening, because apparently my carry-on looked suspicious. Spent 20 minutes watching a very serious man examine my electrical equipment samples like they might explode at any moment. He asked me what a transformer specification sheet was. I explained. He nodded like he understood. By the time I landed in Frankfurt, my checked bag had decided to take a vacation to Amsterdam. The airline promised it would arrive within 24 to 48 hours, which meant I spent my first 2 days in Germany doing client meetings in clothes I'd been wearing for almost 20 hours. Klaus Richter ran infrastructure procurement for Rhine Valley Power, and he was the most skeptical client I'd ever worked with. The guy had been burned by American contractors before, missed deadlines, cost overruns, equipment that showed up and didn't match specifications. He'd made it clear in our first meeting that he didn't trust promises. He trusted performance. Everything else was noise. I spent 4 days doing site visits at locations most executives never see, crawled through electrical substations in rain that felt personal, reviewed transformer specifications with his engineering team until my eyes crossed and my German vocabulary expanded by about 300 technical terms I'd never use in casual conversation. Somewhere around day 3, we stopped at a facility that was having problems with a recent installation. Another contractor's work, not ours, but Klaus wanted to see how I'd handle it. I spent 2 hours with his maintenance team, worked through the issue, and identified a wiring problem that the original contractor had missed. Klaus watched the whole thing without saying a word. When I finished, he nodded once. Just once. But I could see something change in his expression. That evening, we grabbed dinner at a small restaurant near his office. Somewhere between the schnitzel and the coffee, he leaned back and looked at me directly. What happens if Aldrich has internal problems? If there's turnover? Aldrich has depth, I said. But I'll be straight with you. Most of that depth is me and my team. If something changes, you should have options. He studied me for a long moment. Options are good. Send me options. Second stop was outside Austin. The flight from Frankfurt was uneventful, which felt suspicious after everything else. My bag had finally caught up with me. The plane landed on time. I started to relax. Then customs decided I looked interesting. Spent 45 minutes in a small room answering questions about why I'd visited 3 countries in 10 days and what exactly was in the equipment cases I was carrying. The officer kept asking about electrical components, like I might be building something dangerous. I explained transformer specifications approximately 6 times. He nodded and kept asking the same questions. Eventually, his supervisor came over, looked at my paperwork, looked at me, and waved me through with a shrug. Welcome to international business travel. Wade Thornton ran Lone Star Grid Solutions, and he was the biggest potential client in the deal. He'd built his company from nothing in the Texas energy market, which meant he'd survived oil crashes, regulatory changes, and about 6 different economic cycles that should have killed his business. He had 0 patience for corporate nonsense, and a reputation for firing contractors who didn't deliver. I met him at a job site about an hour outside the city. Active construction. Crews everywhere. Equipment moving. We walked the entire site together. Wade asked detailed questions about supply chains, bonding capacity, insurance coverage, backup plans, the kind of questions that told me he'd been burned before and wasn't getting burned again. At one point, we stopped near a row of battery storage units being installed. Wade looked at them, then at me. You're the reason I'm still in this deal. You know that, right? I told him I appreciated the confidence. Not confidence, he said. Observation. Your company's got nice offices, pretty marketing materials, but you're the one who actually knows what's happening. I've worked with enough empty suits to spot the real ones. I mentioned casually that I was always looking at ways to reduce overhead and improve delivery for clients who valued results over presentation. He raised an eyebrow. You starting something? I said I believed in keeping options open. He nodded. Smart. Keep me posted on those options. Third stop was Sao Paulo. Getting into Brazil was its own adventure. My visa had a date discrepancy that the immigration officer found fascinating. We had a 30-minute conversation in my broken Portuguese and his broken English that accomplished absolutely nothing except mutual frustration. Eventually, another officer came over, stamped my passport, and waved me through with what might have been an apology or might have been an insult. Marco ran Verde Energia, a fast-growing utility with aggressive expansion plans, and a CEO who made decisions at a speed that terrified most American contractors. He'd scheduled 4 meetings in one day, a site inspection at a solar farm 2 hours outside the city, and a dinner with his executive team that would run until midnight. The man apparently functioned on 3 hours of sleep and expected everyone around him to keep pace. The site visit was brutal. 2 hours each way in a van with no air conditioning, on roads that had apparently been designed by someone with a grudge against suspension systems. My shoes weren't built for walking solar farms, and I'd lost my boots somewhere in the airline system's digestive tract. By the time we finished, my feet were destroyed, and I was pretty sure I'd developed a minor heat stroke. But Marco was impressed. When he walked me to my cab that evening, he gripped my shoulder. "You are the deal hunter, not your company, not their executives. You. If you ever decide to work for yourself, I want to be your first call. 3 cities, 3 clients, 3 seeds planted in soil. Aldrich infrastructure didn't even know existed. I flew home feeling like I was carrying something valuable and dangerous. A loaded weapon that nobody could see. The call from my brother came 2 days before I left for the international trip. And in retrospect, every alarm bell I ignored should have been deafening. Lucas and I had never been close. 3 years younger. Significantly better at making our parents happy. Had somehow turned a mediocre business degree and a talent for talking into a career of consulting gigs that never lasted more than a year, but always sounded impressive at family dinners. Growing up, he was the charmer, the one who could talk his way out of anything, the one who got caught cheating on a test and somehow convinced the teacher it was a misunderstanding. Our parents adored him. When I saved money from my first job, my parents suggested I lend some to Lucas for his startup idea. When that startup failed, which it did spectacularly, nobody expected him to pay me back. I was the responsible one. Lucas was the creative one. So when he called asking to meet for coffee, I should have been suspicious. He never called to catch up. We met at a place near my apartment. He showed up late, which was standard. He'd always been good at looking successful, even when his bank account told a different story. The conversation started normal. How's work? How's Cassidy? The usual small talk that people use to circle around what they actually want to discuss. Then Lucas started asking questions that felt different. How was the company doing? Were there any big changes coming up? What was my relationship like with leadership? Was I happy there? Had I thought about doing my own thing? That last question should have set off every alarm I had. He had never cared about my career before, except as something to compare unfavorably to his own alleged potential. But I was tired and distracted and focused on the upcoming trip, so I gave vague answers. Things are busy, got some travel coming up, same old grind. Lucas nodded along, asking follow-up questions that felt oddly specific. Did I know Bennett Aldrich? What did I think of him? Had I heard anything about changes in company leadership? I told him Bennett was the CEO's nephew and left it at that. Didn't think much of it. 2 weeks later, sitting on that transatlantic flight with a termination email on my screen, I started connecting dots that should have been obvious from the beginning. Cassidy figured it out first. She'd gotten her hands on my severance paperwork, which had arrived via email about an hour after the termination notice, and she was going through it with the kind of intense focus she usually reserved for contract negotiations. Around page 6, she stopped and looked up. There's a reference here to credible third-party information suggesting competitive activities. What does that mean? I felt something cold move through my chest. Show me. She turned the laptop around. There it was, buried in the legal justification section. Credible third-party sources. Information indicating potential competitive preparations. Grounds for immediate termination without standard notice period. Third-party sources. Someone had talked, and given the timing, the specificity, and the fact that only a handful of people knew about Ironwood, the list of suspects was very short. I called Lucas from the airport the moment I landed. Hunter, how was the trip? I heard you were traveling. How did you hear that, Lucas? A pause. What do you mean? You mentioned it when we got coffee. I said I had travel coming up. I didn't say where or when. How did you know I'd be traveling right now? Longer pause. Look, I don't know what you're implying, but I'm not implying anything. I'm asking a direct question. How did you know about my travel? And why is there a reference to third-party sources in my termination paperwork? Who else knew about Ironwood? Silence. Okay, fine. I've been talking to Bennett Aldrich. We met at a networking thing a few months ago. He's a good guy, Hunter. Really smart. He has some interesting ideas about... What did you tell him, Lucas? Another pause. I don't know. Stuff. We just talk. About business. About opportunities. Did you tell him about Ironwood? About the work I've been doing on the side? The silence told me everything. I'd been careful. Separate devices. Encrypted communications. No paper trail connecting back to Aldrich. Different coffee shops for every meeting. Code names that sounded ridiculous but served their purpose. I'd treated this like a covert operation because I knew how corporate politics worked, but I'd mentioned the project to Lucas 3 months ago, during a family dinner, when he wouldn't stop pushing about whether I'd ever do something for myself, instead of working for someone else's dream. I'd mentioned it in general terms, just enough for him to know I was building something on the side. And Lucas, being Lucas, had seen an opportunity, had recognized that information was currency, had traded his brother's career for a handshake and a promise from the CEO's nephew, probably over expensive dinners, where they congratulated each other on being entrepreneurial spirits who understood how the real world worked. They offered me a job, Lucas said finally, and I could hear pride in his voice. Director of Business Development. Real salary, real title. Bennett said I had exactly the kind of strategic thinking they needed. They used you to get to me. That's not fair. I'm building my own path here. Not everything is about you, Hunter. They used you, Lucas. You gave them everything they needed to time my termination perfectly. Fire me while I'm stuck on a plane over the ocean. No cell service. No way to respond. No chance to talk to clients or protect relationships. Hours before I could contact anyone. You helped them plan that. Silence. When he spoke again, his voice had hardened into something I'd heard before. The tone he used when he was caught, and had decided to go on offense instead of admitting anything. Maybe if you'd helped me more, I wouldn't have needed to look elsewhere. You've got all this success, all these connections, and what have you ever done for your family? You couldn't even give me a reference for that consulting firm. Couldn't loan me money without making me feel like garbage about it. You've always thought you were better than me. I've always thought you were capable of more than you showed. Apparently, I was wrong about that too. Whatever. I found my own path. Sorry if that's inconvenient for you. I hung up without responding. That night, Cassidy and I sat in her apartment, going through everything. The timeline of Lucas's questions. The timing of the termination. The severance paperwork designed to lock me out of the industry. He didn't just leak information, Cassidy said quietly. He helped them plan it. The timing, the approach. He knew you'd be vulnerable on that flight. My brother had sold me out for a job title and a chance to finally be the successful one. I stared at the ceiling for a long time. Then I said, okay, now I know where everyone stands. The HR meeting was scheduled for 9 a.m. the day after I landed. I'd spent most of the night at Cassidy's place, and she'd walked me through exactly what to expect. They're going to make it feel like a formality, she said around 2 a.m. Coffee in hand, highlighter in the other. Like signing is just the obvious next step. They'll act sympathetic. They'll talk about transitions and opportunities, and somewhere in the paperwork, there'll be something designed to bury you. I asked what I should do. Don't sign anything. Don't agree to anything. Don't let them convince you that cooperation will help. It won't. Their only goal is protecting themselves. I showed up at Aldrich headquarters at 8:45. Walked through the lobby I'd walked through 1,000 times. Past the reception desk where everyone suddenly found their computer screens fascinating. Got stopped at the security desk by a guard I'd never seen before. This guy was young, clearly new, clearly nervous. He checked my ID 3 times. Made 2 phone calls where he mostly listened and said, "Yes, sir," a lot. Then he escorted me to a conference room on the 3rd floor, like I was there to rob the place instead of being robbed myself. On the way, we passed my old office. My desk had already been cleared. 7 years of work, and they'd erased every trace of me in less than 24 hours. The only thing left was a company coffee mug I'd never liked anyway. The conference room had 4 people waiting. Janet, the HR director, who I'd had pleasant conversations with for years, and who was now looking at me like I was a stranger who'd wandered in from the street. A lawyer I'd never met who had the vibe of someone who'd foreclosed on an orphanage and felt okay about it. A guy from risk management, who spent the entire meeting taking notes without ever making eye contact. And Bennett, sitting at the head of the table like he'd earned the right to be there, with a folder in front of him and a smile that made me want to rearrange his face. They walked me through the termination paperwork. Position eliminated. Restructuring. Company appreciates my years of service. I would receive severance equal to 3 months' salary, which sounded generous until you read the fine print. In exchange for the severance, I would sign a non-compete covering the entire energy infrastructure sector for 36 months. 3 years. No working for competitors. No starting my own business in the industry. No contact with any current or former Aldrich clients. I sat there and let them finish their script. Didn't interrupt, just listened and cataloged. When they were done, Bennett leaned forward with that smile still plastered on his face. I want you to know there's no hard feelings here, Hunter. We just think the company needs to move in a different direction. More collaborative. Less dependent on individual contributors. I nodded. Then I picked up the severance agreement and started reading. Cassidy had prepared me for this. We'd gone through every possible clause they might bury in the language. And there it was. Page 8, paragraph 4. The non-compete didn't just prevent me from working for competitors. It prevented me from engaging in any business relationship with current or former clients of the company for a period of 36 months. They were trying to lock me out of everyone I'd ever built a relationship with. I put the document down and looked at Janet. I'm not signing this. The room went quiet. Bennett's smile flickered like a bad fluorescent light. The lawyer started explaining how standard this language was, how reasonable the terms were, how I should really consider having my own attorney review things. I let him talk. When he finished, I stood up. I'll take the termination. I'm not taking the severance. And I'm not signing anything that restricts my future employment. Bennett actually laughed. You're walking away from 3 months of salary because you don't like the paperwork? I looked at him for a long moment. The guy who'd taken credit for my work, who'd gotten handed a VP title while I got pushed out the door. I'm walking away because your paperwork is designed to bury me, and I'm not interested in being buried. Then I left. The security guard escorted me out of the building. He apologized quietly near the exit. I told him it wasn't his fault. He looked relieved. 2 hours later, Cassidy and I were at her kitchen table, going through everything I knew about the Bridger deal. The first call came that afternoon. Klaus Richter from Rhine Valley Power. I heard you left the company. What happened? I was terminated. Effective immediately. No explanation. Long pause. That is unexpected. We had concerns about key personnel continuity. This confirms them. I understand if you need to reassess the project. We are reassessing, but not in the way you might think. We're pausing all work with Aldrich until we understand the situation better. If you land somewhere stable, contact me immediately. Within 72 hours of my termination, all 3 Bridger clients had frozen the deal. Klaus called first. Wade called the next morning. Marco's office sent a formal notice that afternoon. Key person risk. Leadership concerns. By the end of the week, the freeze was official on paper, and Aldrich's $380 million pipeline had turned into a $380 million question mark. Bennett's first client meeting without me was a disaster. And I mean the kind of disaster that becomes a cautionary tale people tell at industry conferences for years. I heard about it from Denise, who was still in touch with people inside. Apparently, Bennett had flown to Texas to reassure Wade Thornton that the Bridger project was in excellent hands. Spent 20 minutes talking about synergistic opportunities and collaborative value creation and innovative paradigm shifts. Wade sat there with an expression that witnesses described as slowly turning to stone. Then Wade asked a basic question about battery degradation rates and expected replacement cycles. The kind of question that anyone actually managing this project should have been prepared for. Bennett had no idea. Not even close. He tried to bluff his way through with something about industry standard expectations, which made it obvious he had no clue what industry standards actually were. When Wade pushed for specifics, Bennett apparently said something about the batteries being under warranty, which wasn't even relevant. Wade ended the meeting after 30 minutes. Told his assistant to cancel the dinner reservation they'd made. Lone Star Grid officially withdrew from the project 2 days later with a letter that Wade apparently wrote himself instead of having legal handle it. Rhine Valley followed a week after that. Klaus sent a politely devastating email explaining that his organization could not proceed with a strategic partnership absent the leadership continuity that had been foundational to our engagement. Corporate speak for, we trusted Hunter, not your nephew who doesn't know how batteries work. Verde Energia held on a little longer. Marco was a patient man, and he was willing to give Aldrich a chance to find a replacement who could actually do the job. That chance lasted about 3 weeks. Aldrich sent 3 different executives to Sao Paulo, none of whom spoke Portuguese, understood Brazilian regulations, or had ever actually walked a job site. The third one apparently got lost on the way to the airport and missed a meeting entirely. Marco called me directly one night. I want to work with you. Whatever company you're building, I'm in. Ironwood Infrastructure went from backup plan to active operation in about 72 hours. Cassidy helped finalize the compliance paperwork. My former colleague, Denise, who'd been pushed out of Aldrich 2 years earlier for raising concerns about corner cutting, came on as operations director. Nathan, an engineer I'd worked with on a dozen projects, handled technical specifications. We didn't have fancy offices. We worked out of a rented space in an industrial park that smelled vaguely of the auto shop next door. But we had insurance, bonding capacity, regulatory compliance in 3 jurisdictions, and relationships with every client and supplier that mattered. I sent proposals to all 3 former Bridger clients. Same project scope, leaner structure, direct accountability, no middlemen. All 3 signed within 3 weeks. $380 million in contracts. Gone from Aldrich, landed with me. Walter Aldrich tried to reach me twice during this period. Left voicemails that started angry and gradually became confused. He couldn't understand how 3 clients who'd been ready to sign had suddenly evaporated. Couldn't understand how his nephew, who he'd positioned as the future of the company, had managed to destroy more value in 1 month than most employees create in a career. I didn't return his calls. The really satisfying part was watching the promises collapse. Lucas's director of business development position evaporated about 6 weeks after the Bridger collapse, when Aldrich started cutting costs to stay solvent. No job, no title, just a handshake from a sinking ship and a nephew who'd already moved on to blaming everyone but himself. He texted me twice looking for help. I didn't respond. 6 months later, I walked into Ironwood Infrastructure's new office for the first time as someone who actually owned the company. The conference room had a table I'd bought used from a company that went under, surrounded by chairs that didn't quite match. On the wall near the entrance, someone had hung a simple metal sign, Ironwood Infrastructure, founded by Hunter Mercer. I stood there looking at it for longer than I probably should have. 7 years at Aldrich, and my name never appeared on anything that mattered. Now it was literally on the building. The Bridger project was fully underway. Rhine Valley had broken ground on 2 substation upgrades. Lone Star's first solar installation was ahead of schedule. Verde had expanded their contract twice since signing. Total value across all 3 clients was tracking toward $420 million over 5 years. Walter was removed from his position as CEO about 4 months after the collapse. The board cited strategic differences, which is corporate speak for, "You lost us $380 million and your nephew made us look like idiots." Last I heard, he was consulting for a smaller firm in the Midwest, far away from anyone who remembered his confident predictions about Bennett being the future of the company. Bennett himself lasted about 2 weeks longer than his uncle, resigned to pursue other opportunities. Apparently, he's trying to launch some kind of consulting practice now. I give it 6 months. Lucas got his Director of Business Development title for exactly 43 days before the company started cutting costs. He called me looking for help, then texted, then sent a long email explaining that he was sorry and that families should stick together, and that he was sure I understood it was just business. I didn't respond to any of it. My parents handled the situation exactly how I expected. My mom called to tell me I was being too hard on Lucas, that families should forgive each other, that holding grudges wasn't healthy. She mentioned that Lucas was going through a difficult time and could really use his brother's support. I asked her if she knew what Lucas had done. She said she'd heard his side of things and thought there had been misunderstandings on both sides. I asked her if Lucas had mentioned that he'd been feeding information about me to the CEO's nephew for months. She said she didn't understand corporate things and that I was being legalistic about a family matter. I told her I loved her, but I wasn't interested in having this conversation again. She didn't call for 3 months after that. When she finally did, she didn't bring up Lucas. Cassidy and I got engaged about 2 months after Ironwood officially launched. Small ceremony. She's still doing contracts and compliance work, now as an outside consultant for Ironwood. Turns out having someone who understands legal language and actually cares about your success is worth more than any executive title or family name. The funny thing about revenge is that I never actually planned for any of it. I just built something of my own, protected it carefully, and let the people who underestimated me create their own problems. They did the rest themselves. You don't have to burn anything down. You just have to be ready when it starts burning on its own. And when someone offers you a seat at a table you built yourself, you'll know exactly what it's worth. If you enjoyed this video, please hit that subscribe button. It really helps the channel and help us bring you more and better stories. Thanks.